Welcome to blog number 4, Appointing a Structural Engineer. I hope you're all well. It's a very important function as part of your building project, especially when cutting and carving a house apart or a development apart. One thing when appointing an engineer is that what you want is a commercially sensitive engineer. What I mean by that is to know there's a budget, because they look at it from the engineering aspect, where the architect looks at it from his role. And they're two totally different functions, but they're entwined. And secondly, from a cosmetic perspective, from a client perspective, is you want to see as less visible beams as possible. So you want less beams visible, less columns as possible. And that creates a conflict, sometimes between design. But anyway, good luck with your project.
Blog number 4, Appointing a Structural Engineer. In this short blog, I shall mention a number of points to consider, most of which will not be relevant however. Elements will for your potential project. One thing I have learnt about structural engineers is the desire to over-engineer, and I think this is down to professional indemnity claims. I am fortunate enough never to have worked with a bad engineer however. Conflicts do happen with design and engineering become a conflict, then add an interior designer if you have one. It becomes really interesting to experience, but in all the incidences a compromise is always reached. I do enjoy these kind of meetings. To date, I have never been involved in a project where engineers' designs have failed. My only experience has been over engineering or engineering where it's impossible to install without significant cost to the project. Thus an alternative design needs to be considered to meet the overriding objective. On a side note, it's important that any design drawings for things like dimensions of beams etc. get the engineer to provide them. They will always try and qualify to be checked on site prior to ordering. Get the engineer to provide the dimensions. As a client or builder you want to mitigate risks, I have not objection to check dimensions with the engineer on site. When fabrication drawings are produced, it's important the engineer reviews and signs off prior to ordering, as once steelwork is cut and it's too short, you are stuffed. Prior to ordering steels, I would always discuss with the engineer, architect and services contractors to see if any services holes going to be run through the beam E.G electrical cables or plumbing, and if they are planned to be run through the beam. The size of holes and number of holes need to be agreed, and the engineer would need to approve the number and sizes of the holes. This exercise partially on small projects is overlooked in my experience. Years ago, I used to work with a guy called Peter Cox. He was awesome, old school, and would come to a meeting, ill-prepared, with his notepad and paper and draw designs, and make a decision there and then, often sharing a few fucks and shits. He was very colourful and in his 70s, but it will enable us to progress and order materials, and will follow on with design calculations a few days later for building regulations. I never had anyone query his calculations, and now we have computers to push out the load calculations and data. I believe engineers add 20% on top just to cover themselves. Engineers will deny this for obvious reasons however. I have full respect for the role, as I do for any professional in our industry. I hope I don't offend any engineers, and again, I have never ever had a bad experience with an engineer. Here are things to consider. A structural engineer is a professional who can design, analyze, and inspect the structural elements of a building, such as foundations, beams, columns, walls, roofs, and floors. They can also advise on the suitability, safety, and stability of existing structures, and provide solutions for any structural problems or defects. Some of the things to consider when appointing a structural engineer are: qualifications and experience. You should look for a structural engineer who is chartered with a professional engineering institution, such as the Institution of Structural Engineers or the Institution of Civil Engineers. This means they have met the highest standards of education, training, and competence in their field. You should also check their portfolio of previous projects and ask for references from their clients. Scope and cost of services. You should discuss with the structural engineer what services they will provide for your project, such as structural calculations, drawings, specifications, site visits, reports, and certificates. You should also agree on the fees and payment terms, and whether they include VAT, expenses, and contingencies. You should ask for a written contract or agreement that outlines the scope, cost, and duration of the services, as well as the roles and responsibilities of both parties. Regulations and insurance. You should ensure that the structural engineer is familiar with the relevant building regulations and planning permissions that apply to your project, and that they can liaise with the local authority's building control department or an approved inspector to obtain the necessary approvals. You should also check that the structural engineer has adequate professional indemnity insurance, which covers them for any claims arising from errors or omissions in their work. Quality and communication. You should look for a structural engineer who can deliver high-quality work that meets your expectations and requirements. You should also expect regular and clear communication from the structural engineer, and that they are responsive to your queries and feedback. You should also ask how they will handle any changes, variations, or unforeseen issues that may arise during the project, and how they will resolve any disputes or complaints. I wish you the best in appointing your engineer. Warm regards, Brad. Now here is my little joke. My friend is a structural engineer. He is always complaining about stress at work.